welcome everybody to today's session on Navigating Technology Part 2. In Part 2, we'll present a simple framework on how to best manage technology. But before we dive into that, we also like to put navigating technology in the proper context. Here we have the Strategic Business Execution Framework, and this underpins everything that PMO Advisory does. In this framework, what is suggested is in order to achieve execution excellence, organizations must have the right blend of the various components playing together. That includes value, behavior, and attitude of the people, the important competencies of the individuals as well as the team, the core disciplines such as project management, portfolio management, process improvement, as well as integrating processes like knowledge management, managing issues, navigating change. Those need to come together in order to make the whole greater than the sum of the part. Here we dive a little bit detail into the Strategic Business Execution Framework. And we're not going to go through all the sub-bullets, but it gives you an idea of the various components and activities that we're referring to. Navigating technology in our world falls into one of the important competencies, and navigating technology is there. So as this part of 2, part 1 we discuss the state of IT implementation, and the failure rate of IT project is very high. Here we talked about how to best navigate through the technology scenarios. And there are many frameworks we can use, but we like to keep things simple. Here we present a very simple framework of just plan, build, and sustain. What do we mean by that? In the planning stage, organizations ready to undertake large implementations or significant technology improvements, they should look at and really define what are the goals, objectives, what are the scopes, what are the requirements. And requirements is a tricky aspect. It should be as detailed as possible, but it should also be as flexible as possible. So that requires a little bit of an art. The capability. What is your internal skills and resources? Do people understand technology? Are they going to embrace technology? Or do you need perhaps to hire outside consultants? And then of course, essentially, all the ideas in the world are great until you put them to action. And that's where the action plan comes in. So that's in the planning stage. In the build stage, aside from sort of rolling up your sleeve and get things done, the fundamental blocks that you need are governance, making sure decisions are properly made, project environment. Make sure that there is that mentality of project management. Things are done in a rigorous fashion. Risk management. Risk and reward are always that tension. And for major technologies, sometimes the risk can be fairly high. So that needs to be understood before the actual implementation. And the last piece is sustain. In the sustainment stage, we're talking about how to make the technology work over time. And that talks about the user adoption, organization adoption of the new technology. Transition plan to operations to keep it humming for the duration and the life plan for that particular piece of technology. What is the operating model? What are the service level agreements? Do you have vendors helping? Are you planning to manage the technology in-house? And then of course, how do you continuously improve? Technology is implemented at one point in time, but the world around us is constantly changing. So continuous improvement is to maintain that relevance of that piece of technology to the organization's goals and objectives. On the next couple slides, we're going to dive into a little bit deeper into each of these components. So first, let's look at plan. And this is a big slide. I'm going to try not to read through everything, but there are a lot of content here. Under plan, we put it into 4 major blocks. What are the key questions that organizations need to ask themselves? What are the best practices? Now, these are our best practices, and we're freely distributing that and providing our advice to our clients. But you, of course, need to figure out what are the best practices for your organization. We have what we call a SMARTY system. I'm sure many people heard the word SMART system, but we actually added 2 more components to that. And then lastly is something we use internally, but we believe it is very effective and we advocate our clients to use, is a prioritization schema. And we call it the MOSCOW. It's borrowed from DSDM, Dynamic System Development Methodology. So a little bit key detail. So under plan, there's some key questions. What are the primary goals, project goals? How are they tied to the strategy? That alignment to strategy is critical. Are the goals realistic and achievable? Come over here. How well is the requirement defined? The more specific the requirement, the more specific the target and the objectives, the more likely you're able to plan your action and execute against those. What is the the capability gap of the internal staff of what you need versus what you have? And finally, is there a roadmap? Are there an action plan? Because that's where the rubber meets the road. A couple of best practices that we advocate to our clients. Alignment between the project and organization goals must be well understood, especially if it is a large project, a mission-critical project, a project that may change the organization. 30% rules on vendor management. What do we mean by that? We mean that in order for you as an organization to outsource work to vendors, you still have to have about 30% of that capability in order to manage the vendors effectively. Otherwise, they could run around circles around you, and you really can't tell the difference. And if you don't have that 30%, which just goes to the capability gap, that's when you need to bring in trusted advisor, either another company, consultants, ex-executives, people you trust to give you that best advice. Be truthful and realistic. Changes are tough. Large projects are difficult. So don't undermine it, don't underplay it. Be truthful and make sure that the plan of execution is realistic. Strong requirements. On IT project, this is probably one of the single most contentious area working with vendors, especially if development or testing or design or all three are outsourced. Success metrics. Work sort of a little bit backwards. What does success look like? What are the terminal success metrics? And from there you could figure out what are the enabling metrics. You often get what you measure, and that is very true here. SMARTY system. I'm sure many of you heard of the SMART, to be specific as possible, the 5 W's. You know, that's the what, why, who, when, where, and you can also toss in the hows. Measurable. To the extent that you can make the metrics, not only the terminal metrics, but also the enabling metrics, measurable, quantitative, or even qualitative, the better off you are. Attainable. This is the internal evaluation of the capability. What is your capability gap? Realistic. This is the external look. If you're taking on a project for the first time in your industry, or for that matter, even first time ever in bleeding edge, what is that realistic expectation? Chances are, if you have other players in the industry have done that, then there are lessons learned you could leverage. But there isn't. The realism needs to be measured appropriately. Timely. On large project, especially one that's big with a long duration, is the timing right? At what point do you want to release interim versions of the technology piece? Integrated. How's it aligned with the overall organization's effectiveness and the objectives and the essentials? It's relevant to the project success. What are the most essential components leading to the Moscow that you must implement as part of that technology? Are you considering multiple phases? And if you are, that means in phase 1, what are the most essential features and functions that you need? Then you can move on to phase 2 to elaborate, and phase 3 and so on and so forth. You know, the analogy could be any place. Just think of iPhone. The first generation iPhone has X capability, and if you look at the latest iPhone 5S, it has far more. Same here. Our contribution to the SMARTY is the integration to system, as well as the prioritization, the essentiality of the products, of the features and functions in that project. So let's get into the prioritization. We use a very simple acronym, Moscow. If you take out the vowels, double O, what you have left is MSCW. And it works wonder. Must have are the things that you must have in that technology project. Without it, the project is senseless. So that's the definition of must. You have it, great. Don't have it, let's go back to the drawing board. Should, however, are a little bit softer. They're important. They're very, very important sometimes. But if you don't have it, or if it's not as automated as you wish, it's still a viable project. It's still a viable phase. Could have, this is where you become a little bit, there's still important factors, features and functions or requests, but they're not so critical and essential to that particular phase. And then of course, would like to have a little bit low on the priority. And the idea of the priority, of course, is especially if you're doing multiple phases, the must-have in that phase is done. The should-have that weren't done for the second phase, now they may become the must-have. And the could-have become the should-have, and so on and so forth. So that's planning. By laying out the planning the way we have, we're hoping to give you a very, very solid idea on what it takes to plan a large project properly. The next component is the build. And in the build, this is where the rubber really meets the road. This is where everybody got to roll up the sleeve, all hands on deck. We look at it in three major buckets. What are the key questions for the build stage? What are some of the best practices we use? And what are some of the key challenges that the implementers needs to be aware of? So key questions. What is the governance plan? How are decisions made? How are change requests? Is there a process for managing change requests? And by the way, what if the project requires tough decision making? There needs to be trade-off between, let's say, testing and development, design and engineering. Who's going to make those decisions? And that's where the governance come in. What is a project management approach? Are you going to have a decentralized project in which every team worked by themselves and somebody bring it together? Are you going to have a sort of a traditional waterfall methodology in which it goes through a life cycle phases? Are you going to adopt an agile methodology of rapid application development? So that is the approach. Who are the stakeholders, and are their expectations reasonable? How much influence do they have? How much power do they have? How much are they truly vested in that project? So stakeholder management is a critical issue. Do you have a vendor management plan? Especially, I think, for a lot of our constituents, you use vendors for a variety of technology needs. How do you manage that vendor? How do you ensure that their SLA, service level agreements, meets your expectation? And how do you even measure against that? Remember what we said in the last slide, having 30% of the knowledge of whatever you outsource or ask the vendor to do is critical, because in short of that, you really can't properly manage those vendors. Last question, does the project have realistic scope, schedule, budget, and resources? That is a very, very important question. A couple of best practices that what we do. One is establish project management. Leadership is critical for large, complex projects. Define the processes. And these doesn't have to be complex processes. It could be very basic processes. But for example, who's going to manage the information? Who's going to do the communication? How is status even collected? Who manages the issue, risks, changes? How do we decide on resource capacity planning? Who's going to work on what? Processes, discipline. This is the discipline of execution. And it's more than just project management itself, but project management is a good place to start. Hire the best. We realize every organization is confronted with resource constraints. That's just a fact of life. But given the choices, try to, especially the critical role, find and hire the best that your money can buy. Manage the vendors. Vendors almost always and almost inevitably have a slightly different level, slightly different kind of interest than you do. They are in the business often to make money. You're in the business, at least in this case, to finish the project. The two aren't always aligned. So manage the vendors, and again, go back to the 30% rule. You have to have 30% of the knowledge. And by the way, if you don't, hire a consultant that you trust, hire the ex-executive of the organization, find somebody in the industry that's well known to give you and make sure you have that 30% knowledge. And last, of course, is managing risk. There are many, many project implementation risks. On IT project today, the risks range from traditional project risk, change control, for example, not properly managed. Then individual programmer may decide by themselves to implement a certain change. What that means, what is the risk of that? Well, testing. If it's not documented, nobody even knew what to test, and that could break other things. If change is not properly managed, the customer may not be aware that they're getting it. Or the other side is you promise the customer, but the project team is not aware that you promised the customer. So those are project level risk, but it could be bigger risk. IT project today are fraught with risk around data, confidentiality, sensitivity to information, breach of security. So the list goes on. Couple key challenges. In planning, the situation is often idealized because you could afford to. You could say what if, etc. But in execution, hard work really truly begins. 3 common challenges we see. One is conflict. And there are really 3 different kind of conflict. We listed 2 here. One is a task-based conflict, process-based conflict. There's actually a 3rd one, interpersonal conflicts. Task-based conflicts are conflicts of priority. 2 parties genuinely disagree on the priority of a particular task. Process-based conflicts are disagreement on how to work on something. For example, in one methodology, maybe the status reporting is done in Excel. One other is done online. One was weekly, the other is done on a daily basis. Harmonization of these processes must come together. Interpersonal. And these are pretty straightforward. People who may have worked together in the past may not like working with each other and may not like maybe an easy way of describing it. They may actually quite hate each other. And the worst conflict, of course, is you have all 3 of them, especially the interpersonal. It gets into a vicious cycle. And if it happens among leaders of the project could go into a tailspin and eventually shut down the project. And we have seen that happen. The other challenges are trade-offs. Who's there to help make that trade-off decision? That gets back to the governance. Because often on large project, it's full of compromises and accommodations. But there must be a body that's able to make the decision, say this is the go forward. So trade-offs. And then of course gets into making key decisions. So now we're on our final piece of the framework called sustainment. Technology is more than just planning and building. People actually have to use it. Whether that people, it is your employees, it is your suppliers and vendors, or it is the general population if it is a consumer-facing technology. A couple key questions that need to be asked. And of course, some of them are recommended best practices. So on the questions, what is the user adoption strategy? Do you plan to train them? How do you plan to communicate with them? Do you plan to do, let's say, usability testing to make sure that you have the best mechanism to train these people? So that is one critical question. Second is, what are the user performance metrics? For example here, let's say we are implementing a new timesheet system and our organization is 10,000 people. Before, it took the employees roughly 5 minutes to complete their timesheet on a weekly basis. Now we know when we first release the timesheet application, it will take longer. It's a new environment, it's a new system. The question is, how long does it take before these users get back to the original time? And of course, from there, hopefully exceed that and make it more efficient. So that is an example of performance metrics. How are they tracked and monitored? Who's tracking them? Who's monitoring them? What is the transition plan from the project to the operation? The project is over. There's an operational team. If it is an operational team, that's going to take over the day-to-day management of the new technology. What is that transition plan? And how are improvement suggestions managed? Especially on large-scale projects, there are multiple phases across potentially multiple years. There needs to be a mechanism in which ideas for improvements, whether process or technology, be captured, considered, categorized, prioritized, and eventually implemented. So that's that question. And of course, that ties very closely to continuous improvement. Continuous improvement, of course, could also be in the back end, what people don't see. That includes improving the performance of the system, having more robust backup strategy, restore procedures, and so on and so forth. A couple best practices from our experience. One, think from the customer's perspective. Of course, the first word is who are our customer. That needs to be defined. But once you define who are our customers, make it easy for the user to adopt the technology. I was working on a very large project for one of my former employers, and essentially the question I challenged the team is, how do we remove every single roadblock from the project in which the users have no exceptions other than to adopt our technology? Because every one of the problems they thought of, we already removed that roadblock. Second is, and tied to that, is remove the likely excuses from technology. Oh, it's new, it's challenging, we don't know how to use it. Great, here's a job aid. Here's a training program for you to go to. So make it easy for the customers to say yes. The second is establish robust operation. And this is often a fairly poorly thought of area during the project implementation phase. And the reason being is it's further ahead in the future. So it receives relatively little upfront attention. That is a mistake. In ITIL and other frameworks, they'll tell you, you should really start planning from the date of operations. And the project work, in that sense, is in support of building the most robust application that can be supported. Define operational metrics, especially service level. For example, if there's an urgent issue, the system is down, how long does it take before somebody actually is alerted and start working on the problem? On that service level. Be very clear on the processes to manage issues, defects, enhancement requests, and service requests. On a large application, business users inevitably will make a lot of demand on the system. They want reports to show the timesheet, for example, and the timesheet may be analyzed between the client engagement, internal, or between different departments. All these are service requests, or they may want it to have additional enhancement to the report that they have so they have the better ability to filter. Regardless of what that is, there needs to be clear processes on how to best manage them. Okay, I think this covers our simple framework of plan, build, and sustain. We hope you find this session to be useful. If you have any questions, if you need any assistance with especially, for example, the 30% vendor management rule, feel free to contact us at www.pmoadvisory.com. Thank you again for your time and have a wonderful day.